Welcome to the next episode of Podcast Payoffs. My name is Gord Vickman, here as always with my partner Dan Sullivan, and a very special guest joining us today, Dan. His name is Paul Colligan. Has a long, rich history with you and also a strategic coach. Paul is a consultant, an executive producer, keynote speaker as well, and he shares strategies that really work in the podcasting industry. So naturally, he'd be a good fit for Podcast Payoffs. He's a good friend of ours and a good friend of the show as well. Author as well of the bestsellers How to Podcast and Podcast Strategies books. How's that for an intro, Mr. Colligan?
Man, I'll take it. Send this to Mom, would you?
Already done. Technology made that possible.
Yeah, I think my introduction to Paul actually precedes my first podcast. I talked with you. I met you as I meet practically everybody else through Joe Polish. You know, I talked about it, and here we are probably 7-8 years later. And I got my own podcast manager.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, Dan. Episode 1, I did a little research here. Episode 1 of 10X Talk was August 3rd, 2012. So we're nearly 9 years ago.
Almost 9 years.
Yeah.
9 years, yeah.
And I got some fun stats. We'll be chatting.
It's a great segue, Paul. What have you seen happen in those almost 10 years? Let's say one thing that really stands out. That's a pretty heady question, but...
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to make the transition really easy for you. I started the game in 2000. I had dinner with the CEO of Audible, and I was hooked, and I wanted to launch on Audible. And he told me, you can launch on Audible. It's $500K to get in, and we get 70%, you get 30%. And there's this, Hogwarts, mystical witch character book that's doing it. And there's this Tom Clancy guy who's doing it, so you can join us. And I walked away completely defeated. I wanted to be Audible, but I couldn't at that point. Podcasting pops up. Bam. I can be Audible now.
Mm-hmm.
That was my instant out the door idea. And it was so much so that although podcasting was free, about 2 years later, I was done with the first premium podcasting platform called Premium Podcasting. Spent about $20,000 getting developed, and about, all 4 of my clients at $97 a month were big fans. I got in way, way, way too early. They say 1 step ahead, you're a visionary, 2 steps ahead, you're a martyr. I was about 10 steps ahead. So from day one, I wanted people paying for podcasts. I wanted, the premium, the HBO, I remember when I was a kid in the 70s, what? Daryl pays for TV? Yeah, but Daryl got King Kong without commercials, and all I had was stupid Saturday morning cartoons. So I wanted to pay for podcasting for a long time. People came up with it. Apple announced just recently, we're going to do it. It's out. It's rolled out. The software is there. And boy, is it fascinating, because now it's in the same place. And it's not just go to a website, sign up, give a credit card, but it's that same one-click functionality that we have for our apps that has created a $1 billion economy. Mm-hmm. So this is interesting. So yes, paid podcasting. I saw it a long time ago. It's now, with the cool kids, if you will. I think it's going to get really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Gord would go to podcasting conferences, and the talk is, how do you monetize your podcasts? And we approach podcasting the same way, we approach our quarterly books. And that is that, first of all, our podcasts are really for our existing clients. And then they are the marketing network that sends the podcasts out to other people. But I was trying to think of an image of how we approach podcasting and virtually all of our other marketing. It's kind of like the tide coming in. You're probably pretty close to the seashore where you can watch the tide come in. And it's hard to imagine when the tide's out how it actually gets in, because it's, and it takes about 6-7 hours, and the ground isn't even wet, and 7 hours later, it's 10 feet deep. And so our whole point is that every podcast is a little wave coming in, but the depth of the tide, when it's full tide, is signups for the program. So for example, the Who Not How book, 3 weeks ago, we have 120 direct signups for Strategic Coach. We're at about 135, 140,000 copies right now. One of our marketing tech people looks at conversations where it's clearly stated that the reading of the Who Not How book was the deciding, it was the trigger that got people to sign up. The lifetime value of a client is $40,000, so 120 times 40,000. The next one goes in next week. It's the gap in the gain. So my whole attitude is that you just keep massaging the marketplace with messages, and then you pay attention to what your real sale actually is.
We have 4 questions here. Question number 1 is, what do you want the podcast to do? Question number 2 is, how do you know the podcast is doing it? Done. Yeah.
What do you think it means, Paul, that everything's kind of branching out right now? Like the way we handle them at Strategic Coach, we're sending out these, first of all, livable assets online. If there's some issue that a client has that one of our people is discussing with them, we probably have something in our arsenal where Dan and Shannon have discussed that in the past, or perhaps Dan with another client on multiplier mindset. They can send that out to them. So it's like doing a sales call without actually having to do a sales call to cover those issues. So that's the theory, and that's the strategy behind the Strategic Coach family of podcasts, is we're sending out the messages, like Dan said, to massage people. We've never had a billboard in Kenya, but I know for sure there's 14 people who really like one of our shows in Kenya because we know that through our analytics. Will we ever have our first Kenyan client? Probably, because that's what we're doing.
One of the signups is from Kenya.
Well, there we go.
Kenya, Ghana. So we have 2-hour Zoom calls. So when somebody signs up for the virtual program, so the big upswing has been people who are never going to come to a workshop. They're doing virtual workshops. So it's a 4-hour workshop that they do every 2 months. So it's 6 times a year, and then they get 2 connector calls. So they get 18 events a year. But I had a Zoom call, and it really struck me how much life has changed in a year. Somebody from Taipei in Taiwan, Vietnam, somebody from Ho Chi Minh City and Mumbai in India, Dubai, Ghana, Barcelona, Berlin, Amsterdam. What these people are, Paul, they're all people who have signed up for the program, but they haven't come to their first workshop yet. Okay. And one thing is that that's something that we could never have done in the past without, the Zoom platform. But what's really interesting when you dig deeper, they've listened to podcasts for the last 5-6 years.
Yep.
So we felt that when we came in with Zoom, because no incentive, like no alternative. So we went there, we weren't hitting a cold audience. We weren't hitting a cold marketplace. There were a lot of people, and they had sort of in their back of their mind, they had checked a box, someday I'm going to bite the bullet and I'm going to get on a plane and I'm going to go to Strategic Coach. Well, last year has eliminated that barrier. So we're up to 400 who have signed up just for the virtual only program.
That's fantastic. And Gord, what you said, I think we're in it. We're drinking the Kool-Aid. But what's amazing here is sales calls are long, sales calls are tedious, and sales calls are expensive. And when somebody calls and says, I listened to the first 50 episodes of 10X Talk, I'm in, sign me up. We got rid of the long and the tedious and the expensive, and we went instantly to the conversion. Joe Polish called me once, and he said, how do we put ads on I Love Marketing? Like, Joe, no. I Love Marketing Sales Genius Network. And we figured out he'd have to put ads on 1.8 million downloads or something to get the conversion, and I'm like, if you can't get, somebody in a Genius Network out of every 1.8 million downloads of I Love Marketing, you better hang up the show, Joe. Mm-hmm. You better hang up the show.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at your stats right now. I have access to 10X Talk. If it's okay with you, can I share a number or two?
Yeah, please.
So in 2021, you've already had 188 downloads of episode 1 that was released
9 years ago.
8/3/12. And so, I mean, this is insane, 188 different times. And what's funny is 17 of them are on Pandora, where most of the country doesn't even know that there are podcasts. And we certainly dreamed a podcast on Pandora at the time that we launched this. And 24 of them were on Spotify, which didn't even exist when we launched this. Mm-hmm. And so what's amazing here, and countries, 3 in India, 5 in South Africa, 8 in Australia. And this is just Croatia's in there, big Croatian fans, Germany, France, they're all there. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I don't think you've gotten up in the morning and wondered whatever happened to season 1 or episode 1. That thing just exists. It's just an ever-running asset.
It takes a while to actually understand it yourself, but it takes quite a while to explain it to someone else that an old podcast series is always new to the person who's listening to it for the first time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And what they're delighted with. I mean, I just came across I'm a voracious reader, especially, detective stories, homicide stories. So I just came across a writer who died 15 years ago. And this is the first time that I've actually read anything. And he had 9 books that were written in the 1970s, 80s. And I said, I found a new writer. But first of all, he was around a long time, but I just discovered him. It's the same thrill as a new writer bringing out a new book last month.
Yeah.
You just found something new. And it also points, I think Gord really marinated me with this when he came in and, took over the structure and the organization of what we're doing. He said, what you're selling is a relationship. And he said, once you get this relationship, you don't have any competitor. I notice myself, the podcasts that I go to, that I'm there because I'm just checking in with somebody that I know really well. And I like his point of view. I like how he thinks about things. And I like the guests that he has on. I like the people that he introduces me to.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard because you think about it as radio, but radio has spectrum scarcity.
Right. Exactly.
But there is no spectrum scarcity.
Right. Never in a million years.
You can't fill up the podcast spectrum and nobody can own it.
They're certainly trying, but yeah.
Because what happens is, I'm looking at these stats. I mean, let's talk about spectrum. In a million years, you've got some big dreams over there at Coach, but I don't think anybody ever said, what about our South Africa distribution model?
Mm-hmm.
And, you didn't have anybody check into radio. It's probably cheap in South Africa to get radio time, but you never asked for it. You never thought about it. It just happened. And the total cost of your entire South African distribution policy is zero, complete zero cost. So let them, let them download. And that's so different than whereas if you send them a copy of the quarterly book, there's some cost there. If you had them attend an event, you're paying whoever's teaching the event. I went to a coach thing in downtown Portland. I think Paul ran that one way back in the day. And I'm looking around the room. Okay, each of those croissants was $6. The coffee was this. How much are they spending to make this happen? Nothing in the podcast. Nothing in the podcast. And so as a result, you can try things that you weren't able to try before. You never would have thought of the Mumbidian strategy, but boy, you're taking the clients, I mean, is there a Mumbidian strategy up on the whiteboards at Coach?
There is. We spend about 30% of our working time thinking about it. Yeah, it's really, really vital.
Yeah.
And the model of, people think of podcasting like radio, and the model is, if I'm doing a show here in Portland, I got to get a local restaurant to buy the time, which means I got to get a certain amount of people in Portland to listen to the show to buy the time to make the local restaurant in Portland pay for it. But if I have one listener in every city, every country paying me lifetime value of 40 grand, this is a multi-million-dollar industry. How dare I think that this is about an ad for a local restaurant?
Paul, in a roundabout way, I think I know the answer to this, but Dan and I were speaking on a previous episode of Podcast Payoffs, bullish or bearish on the entire, I don't even know if I can call it a trend yet, of the subscription-based podcast model that Apple is introducing and that Spotify is introducing. You're walling yourself off from that global audience. Yay or nay? In your opinion, is this going to fly?
Yay, but it's not the scarcity side of yay. I went to school UC Santa Barbara. If you wanted to get drive time, there was one news station. People driving home from work, all you had to do was to buy the one ad on that one news station and you owned the entire town. That was an expensive process. That was an expensive thing. I don't have to worry about that anymore. There is revenue to be made by premium podcasting. There is revenue to be made by paid podcasting, but back, what do you want the podcast to do? I want to pay all the bills to premium. That's one model. What do you want the podcast to do? I want to bring in new lifetime clients at 40 grand lifetime value. That's another model. And so it's there. I mean, Audible is essentially premium podcasting. It's a nice little industry. I haven't really listened to a book on tape in so long, but they're doing okay. So it's not that the paid podcasting kills the free podcasting. It's that paid podcasting comes in the genre and makes things easier.
Yeah. Do you know Carrie Oberbrunner? Have you ever met Carrie? Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Carrie does all of our audibles. So with the quarterly books, he did a backlog because he came on when we already had about 10, 12 out there. So we did backlog. Some of it is subscription, but he'll do a Facebook Live interview with me when the book comes out. So we do about an hour.
Yeah.
And we'll get about 1,000, on the call. And then that goes out to all their connector friends and that. So you probably reach about 20, 25,000. And then it goes on Amazon at that moment. It's one of our free zone collaborations because there's money that gets generated from, the sale of the Audible subscriptions and everything like that. And we just say, well, that's your money, Carrie. That's not how we make our money. We don't make our money from Audible subscriptions. Right. That really tells me that if you're in a position and you've got a good business model and you've got good cash flow and it's sort of a predictable cash flow, I'll trade money for capability anytime. In other words, if I can get a capability that just gets me. Nobody was putting my stuff on Audible before Carrie came along. And now I'm on 39,000. And one of my favorite bookstores, it's a London, and it's one of these 5-store book.
Okay.
It's right near Piccadilly. It's very, very central and everything else.
Waterstone, I think, is what you're looking for.
Waterstones. Waterstones.
That wasn't me. That was the Oracle.
Yeah.
Stealthily find Waterstone.
They have 3 restaurants in the bookstore, and they have sofas, and they have cafes and everything. So the first one we went out, it appeared on their Audible platform. It appeared 72 hours after.
Yeah.
The last one, it appeared 36 minutes after we went on. So I said, that's a nice measurement. Yeah. And what you're doing is that you're just massaging the world around a particular relationship. That's what I see. I mean, it's a forever project because when would you not want somebody in the world who you can have a relationship with?
Yeah. I do think what's fun here, and I think what's important here is there's a role for this. A lot of talk is, a lot of podcasts subscribe on tip jars and Patreon and this type of thing. There's a lot of people saying, well, basically with the premium, Apple has turned on the one-click tip jar, and there are several of my friends who are just putting their same podcast behind premium and people can pay, $2 a month for it if they want. That one makes me a little bit nervous because, do you want $2 a month from a lot of people, or do you want 1 out of every 1,000 to give you 40 grand lifetime? That's the number that you want to look at. Mm-hmm. And I think there's definitely room for premium. There are musicians right now who are like, forget the albums. I'm done. I'm going to release a single, going to put it on iTunes. I'm going to make my iTunes. That model's there. But the real money is, John Cougar Mellencamp was one of the last concerts here in town before we all got shut down. You know how you got Johnny's new CD? By going to the concert. Because the CDs used to sell the concert. Now the concert sells the CDs. Yeah. And it's an interesting place. So it's going to exist. It's going to be good. We're going to play with it to see what it means and how the interface is. But I think on the bigger level, what do you want the podcast to do? If anybody wants the podcast to bring in people more than 4 figures, it's not advertising. It's the long-term relationship the podcast makes possible. Just track it and know if it works.
Paul, how are you approaching? I mean, you're a scout, you're an explorer, you're a geographer. You're basically giving structure to the podcast world. So you're someone who is someone that you would want to stay in touch with. I'd like to know how Paul's thinking about this. You, as your own knowledge and your own content, how are you approaching it right now? That might be different from, let's say a year ago.
This is a new line of revenue. They didn't fix the old line. They didn't replace things. So you got to think of it newly. And so I'm going to create some content just to sell it, and I'm going to put that online. I'm going to play with it. If you look at logic, part of why podcasting is so fantastic is it's one standard that nobody owns. That's why it won. That's why it did so well. Yet on the premium side of things, everybody has their own standard. You could do premium on Apple and you could do premium on Spotify, but it's 2 entirely different interfaces. There will be a standard for this that'll be coming soon. Whether or not Apple jumps on it or not will be interesting. But so I always play, I always dip into it. I'll put some stuff out there. I will see what happens. But more importantly, I'll spend some time just investing in people who do this. I'm going to buy some product. I'll probably spend $500-600 by the end of the year on different premium podcasts just to see how they handle it and how they play that.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is the tech does stack on itself. And this is the thing that gets me really interested. There's a concept called dynamic ad insertion, which, get this, is the insertion of ads dynamically. I know, crazy technology talk. We can click a button over at Genius and we could run ads for June 2021 on your August 2012 episode of 10X, brand new. And it's funny, people are like, oh, that's crazy. Well, turn on the TV. MASH was in the 70s. They're running commercials from today on it. It's not that crazy of a concept. You can just do that. I think what's interesting is, imagine if somebody paid for the content, yet still got ads inside of it. Why would people do that? Happens on Hulu. Mm-hmm. HBO just released the ad-based version of the Hulu app. Now you can qualify the audience a little bit. It's hard to track. Mm-hmm. How many of these downloads? We have a mutual friend, I'm pretty sure you know him, who is convinced that he is massive in Sri Lanka because of 80% of his downloads come from Sri Lanka. I'm like, no, my friend, you are not massive in Sri Lanka. There is a server farm somewhere that is doing these downloads. And this premium gateway could be really, really interesting, because if it was 99 cents to get in, how many 99 cent subscribes do I get from Sri Lanka? I buy, internally, I'm in Coach, I'm in 10X now. We have this big membership site where we can download everything. Half of your quarterly books aren't on Kindle yet inside of the membership site. Paul deals with it. He goes to Amazon, he clicks the button and he downloads the Kindle version because who cares at this level?
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a play for it. So I think.
Well, and they're 99 cents on Kindle because.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm going to be okay.
I mean, again, we're trying to establish a relationship here.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go exactly to that. Free downloads of the quarterly book, which is possible on Amazon.
Yeah.
What does that tell you? 99 cents is a much better metric for how many people are taking this book seriously.
Yeah.
What's the Joe Polish line? If you don't pay, you don't pay attention.
And the line is...
Joe Polish, thank you.
The line is from 0 to a penny. If they're willing to pull out the credit card, it doesn't have to be much. And so that's where I think premium podcasting is going to get interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned dynamic ads, Paul. So one of the things we do, I talk to coach clients all the time. And one of the questions that I'm sure you get all the time throughout all the conferences and the speaking engagements you are engaged in is, how do I make money off this thing? And just to wrap up this episode, because we're almost out of time, but we use the dynamic ads not to sell anything directly, because that would be like going from making googly eyes across the bar at someone to walking over and asking them to marry you.
Right.
It's like, slow down, cowboy.
Right.
Let's hold hands first. We have dynamic ads running on top of Inside Strategic Coach and Multiplier Mindset, sending them to a broadcast-friendly URL that I bought. It's freetoolkit.coach.
Yep.
You can't forget that, even if a donkey kicks you in the head.
Yep.
freetoolkit.coach.
Yep.
You go there, you download 4 of Dan's favorite tools for free. But guess what? The tools are gated. So now we know who you are. Yeah. We know how to reach you because, you have your email address. And then we have our qualifiers. So are you an entrepreneur? And from that, which never existed before, these shows that we had were going out into the atmosphere. Now we have a way to establish that relationship. And we are generating, it's just been a slow burn at first because people, I think, were trying to get their head around it as well. But we are generating dozens of qualified leads from that funnel squeeze from the podcast in there. So the dynamic ads.
That you recorded how many years ago?
And it lives on. Yeah. You know what? It's the Gap in the Gain mini book and the impact filter.
There we go.
And people love it. They love it.
Yeah.
Well, again, if it's the first time you're encountering something that's brand new.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't realize that good content lasts forever. Yeah. I guess.
Yeah. Oh, if Dan ever released, the Gap in the Gain 22 version, the Gap in the Gain 23 version, the Gap in the Gain 24, Gap in the Gain exists. It's fine. Yeah. We got the small book and the big book version of it, but that's it. We don't have to go back and investigate that again.
Yeah.
In our mindset scorecard, I don't know if that's part of the toolkit that you're giving away, but in our mindset scorecard, one of our things is assets, not episodes. Mm-hmm. And once you create an asset, you can run that forever, and then you run the dynamic ads up against it. freetoolkit.coach. You could run an ad right now saying, well, the whole world's coming back to work from COVID. And you're trying to figure out your role as an entrepreneur in the midst of this. There's no better time to consider it. That you run for a little while. Then in November, you might run we're back in quarantine, or maybe you don't run that one. We'll find out what happens in November. But, but you can run new ads, updated ads. Hey, it's 2022. What better time to look at the free coach toolkit? Mm-hmm. So keep the content, keep the asset, not the episode, but change dynamically the ads. It's a beautiful game.
And like your John Mellencamp concert, Paul, people love hearing the hits.
Exactly.
Play the hits. Paul Colligan, where can people find more about you?
Oh, paulcolligan.com. I have a fun newsletter called Heads Up Tuesday. Every Tuesday, we give you the heads up on what's happening in the industry. And it's 5 links, 5 clicks, above the fold when it lands in your email box, even on the phone. So headsuptuesday.com if you want to know what's going on there.
Yeah, excellent. So this is a 2-part series, wrapping up for this one. Dan, Paul.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
We'll see you on the next episode.